Hi, Darryl. How's it going?
I'm doing well. I'm excited about this conversation with Kyle.
Yeah. So, welcome to the Imperfect Cafe. We're setting up your conversation with Kyle McDowell.
Yeah.
Pretty interesting, author, entrepreneur, leader. He's done some big things in the corporate world. It's having some big impact. What are you looking forward to?
So I think anytime we talk with the leader, I'm excited to hear about their perspective. We label this place the Imperfect Cafe, gives them a heads up that we're going to talk about places where we failed, or leading with our imperfections. I would love to hear, we're going to have someone who's got a great deal of leadership experience. I started looking through the 10 W's that he has, and I love that notion of we before me. That notion of taking ownership of things rather than being more passive about it.
Absolutely.
And I'm hopeful that this is actually someone who's got insight around levers that we can pull instead of just theory.
Yeah. He talks they review the book and they talk about a culture of excellence and starting with we. And I think, from my team perspective of all things, it really does resonate. And we're looking for that alignment. I listened to a little bit of some of his interviews, and he's done some big things, with big teams, which is super exciting. Some super big change projects that gives him a place in which he can launch from.
Yeah, and he's going to have some experiences. Any of these leaders, there's not a lot of people who've led more than 15,000 people.
Yeah.
And so that perspective is always valuable. And, I've listened to a little bit of his stuff. He seems like a good guy. I'm really looking forward to chatting and hopefully we connect.
Yeah, I'm interested. I guess one question I'd like you to see if you can, dig through is around insight of where the we's came from and how he came to manufacture them. They feel like they come from experience.
Right. Yeah, and I think there's some overlap there between the work that he's doing and the work that we do. And so exploring some of that as well, because I think there's elements of integrity, there's elements of benevolence there, and an element of exploring the context a little bit. So I'm going to try to dig deeper on those.
Well, when we talk about acts of vulnerability and the things we expect out of a team, right? We take action. Just the ability to step into stuff. Sometimes you don't know what you're stepping into, and you're still going to do it. So, we own our own mistakes. So accountability, getting back to integrity, but also, being transparent and how that connects to the framework, the trust framework, and an integrated model. I think there's going to be lots of overlaps.
Lots of overlaps, and maybe a couple places where we don't overlap, and that'll be interesting to explore as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Looking forward to it.
Well, have a great conversation.
Hi, folks. Thank you for joining us on the Imperfect Cafe. I'm Darryl Stickle. I'm fortunate to be joined by Kyle McDowell. Kyle was a senior executive leading thousands of people, over 15,000 people, and has become a best-selling author, coach. He wrote a book on leading with we, and he wants to root out some of the toxic behaviors we see in organizations. So he's a fellow traveler. Like me, he's tilting at windmills. So welcome to the show, Kyle.
Hey, Darryl. Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So we started having a conversation when I decided to hit record. And I'd love to hear more about your origin story. How did you get where you are today?
Man, started from very humble beginnings. I was raised in a very middle-class family. in a very rural area. I grew up in what is known as the strawberry capital of the world. So was surrounded by pastures and farms. That's a city called Plant City, Florida, just down the road from where I live now in Tampa. But
Okay.
I was an athlete growing up and started to play the role of a leader, quote unquote, air quotes, throughout my sporting life. And then I took a job in corporate America literally right out of high school. I was 17 when I applied. I was 17 when I interviewed, and I rolled the dice that my birthday would come and I would turn 18 before an offer was going to arrive, and it worked. So I started in a tiny cubicle at a local bank here in Florida and just managed to work my way through the labyrinth of the corporate world. And as you mentioned, before I stepped away from corporate America, I had pretty massive roles or led massive organizations, I should say. My last two roles in the corporate world, collectively, I led more than 30,000 people across the country and around the globe at certain portions as well. And, I guess I kind of consider myself a student of leadership. And a lot of my lessons came from really, really bad leaders, what I would call a boss, not a leader. But I was really fortunate, Darryl, in that the last 4 or 5 years of my career, I stumbled across this thing called principle-based leadership, a term that I was not at all familiar with. And it not only changed my professional life, man, it changed my personal life. And it was the genesis for the book coming to fruition. You mentioned my book, Begin With We. It's been out a little over a year now. And among other things, it's so exciting that I get to meet guys like you along this journey. So here we are.
Now, how does a guy get from Plant City, Florida, to one of the top MBA programs in the world at Northwestern?
Wow. I'd be remiss if I didn't start with my parents. I mean, my parents both had incredible work ethic. My mother was an executive in her own right. My dad, a salesman for an electrical distribution company. I can't ever recall them ever complaining about going to work. Now, I'm not naive. They didn't wake up spry and spring out of bed and run to the office, but they taught me the value of a dollar and that if I wanted something, I had to work for something. Nothing in this life was going to be given to me. And then I noticed as I started to ascend within the corporate world, I noticed a lot of apathy, and I noticed a lot of kind of mediocrity connected to that apathy, which is totally understandable. And I felt like if I wanted to make a difference in my own life, I needed to do a little bit more than those around me, and just try to get shit done, for lack of a better expression. I wanted to be the guy that people could lean on to get things done, and it worked out.
Nice. So you talk about toxic leadership. Do you have some examples?
Well, we've all seen it, man. It's the boss. It's right. It's the boss that knows everything, has all the answers, not a lot of empathy for the world that you live in as a member of his or her team. Results matter more than how they are achieved. It's duplicity at its finest. It's something I got very comfortable with, observing it all the time. And there's this, I guess there's an overarching theme as I look back now that's so obvious, but I didn't catch it until the last several years. And that is this paradigm that for someone to win, someone else must lose. Right. And my man, right, there's no further thing from the truth. There's enough shine for everyone, for all of us. So that is, and it was the classic example of a do as I say, not as I do type leader. I'll never forget. And I tell the story in the book that I had a boss one time that he without apology said, "Hey, my boss is out today. When the boss is away, I do play. So I'll be out of here about noon today. Let me know if you need anything." So this double standard was so prominent in the way he led that, it left an impression this many years later. So those are a couple of examples, but probably not foreign to any one of your listeners right now.
Yeah, we're seeing a real dearth of leadership right now in the world, in my opinion. And I you may not agree with me, but I think that being an exceptional leader is harder than it's ever been because things are changing so quickly in terms of norms and values and technology and expectations of different generations. And I gotta say right now, it feels a bit like the social contract is broken. You know, we're looking at the generation behind us, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And they look out and they go, okay, so you want me to work hard. And this message you keep sending me is work harder, work harder, work harder. But I see this division between the haves and the have-nots.
Yep.
And it keeps growing. And I've lost any sense that I could ever afford a home or buy a car or go on vacations, like that life that we were led to expect if we worked hard.
Yeah.
So in that backdrop, how does a leader get people engaged?
Yeah. I'd love to react to something you said that got my attention as well as answer the question. And the premise of your question was being a leader today is harder than ever. And I'll add to that, my man, it's always been hard. You're right. It's absolutely harder than ever. But I think there's this misconception that, you know, once you hit a certain title or a certain level in an organization, the job gets easier. You don't do any work. Everybody else, you know, the underlings do the work. And to some extent, in some organizations, that's certainly true.
Right.
But a good leader or an effective leader, being one of those is a very hard job, no matter what the industry or no matter how big the team or the function that you oversee, because you have to show up every single day. And I don't mean physically. I mean, you must lead in a way that inspires others every single day. And that's hard, man. I'm an equity partner in a local company here that I spend a fair amount of time in. And there are certainly days, Darryl, I walk into that office and I don't have the juice, man. I just don't have the energy. Yeah. But I have to, I quite almost literally pick myself up and be like, this is what you signed up for. Let's go.
Yeah.
So it is hard, but the deeper into your question is the other reaction, which is so true, is the social contract that we've all grown up and we're kind of lured into subscribing, is very, very different. And the inflection of generations that you mentioned is hugely, is a huge contributor to the scenario in the environment that we're in. But I think it's exacerbated by today the workforce has more options than ever before. Right. Yeah. So I ain't going to put up with it the way that someone might have put up with it in years past, because they know there are opportunities around the corner. There are gig opportunities, those type of things. So it is very difficult to be an effective leader today. For many years, decades probably, the employer set the thermometer, the barometer, whatever gauge you want to use for behavior and how we were going to treat each other inside the organization, how we were going to be public facing in the things that we do in our mission. And that is not quite as true today. I think the employee has a much bigger and louder voice in how the organization is run. And we can debate that, whether that's true or not and the impact it's having. But even if I'm partially correct, and with the premise that you outlined, it's never been more difficult to be an effective leader. There's not a lot of loyalty any longer. And who could blame the workforce for losing that loyalty? And that's kind of the apathy I mentioned earlier that I started to experience throughout my career, man. So yes, I couldn't agree more. It's a very tough time.
Yeah. Well, and we start to, there's been comments about, this generation. I actually believe that they're responding to the context just like every generation before them.
Yep. Couldn't agree more.
They see the rules in place and they kind of go, this works for me, this doesn't work for me. And for me, I focus on trust, right? Wrote my doctoral thesis on building trust in hostile environments. That's where my focus is. And I believe that the more senior we become, the less direct control we have over outcomes. And the more dependent we become on those we lead for our goals and objectives to be met. And so in these environments, we actually need to figure out how to engage people So that they're not just showing up for the paycheck, but they're actually excited about the work we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
They want to follow. They're not forced to follow. They want to follow. And that's what really resonated for me with some of your 10 W's. And I'm not going to get through all of them.
No.
But there's some really strong overlap in the work that you do and the conversations that I have with leaders around trust. For me, trust is a combination of uncertainty and vulnerability. When we're deciding whether to trust someone, we ask ourselves two fundamental questions. The first one is, how likely am I to be harmed? And the second one is, if I'm harmed, how bad is it going to hurt?
Ooh.
And those multiply together to give us a level of perceived risk. And the challenge we're facing right now is that our uncertainty is bouncing all over the place. And so some of I think all of the 10 We's that you put forward actually help us reduce uncertainty for those we lead. And I think about the overlap. So for me, when we're trying to build trust, uncertainty comes from either us as individuals or from the setting that we're embedded in. And there are 3 levers we can pull as individuals. Those are benevolence, so have your best interest at heart and act in your best interest. Integrity, do I follow through on my commitments and do my actions line up with the values that I express? And ability, do I have the competence to do what I say I'm actually going to do? And I look at some of your We's and they line up.
That's why I'm smiling. Yeah. I don't think any of my We's are as eloquent or as articulated the way that you just said it. So I take that as a compliment, but I did hear the overlap as well.
Yeah. So when we think about integrity, you talk about, we are going to say what we're going to do and then we're going to do it.
Right on.
That's an integrity action right there.
We number 3. Yep.
Yeah. And that, we are going to own our mistakes.
Yes, sir.
And, we're going to take action. And it's okay to make mistakes. And this is one of the places I find leaders struggling is, that feeling like they need to be perfect.
Yeah.
Like we can't make mistakes. And if we're going to innovate, if we're going to adapt as the world changes around us, we're going to make mistakes.
Right. That's right.
And so as a leader, how do you step into that and say, okay, it's okay for us to make mistakes. These are learning opportunities. So how do you get leaders to buy into that?
Yeah, maybe for a bit of context for your audience. So the 10 We's that you mentioned, they're obviously the foundation for the book, but I didn't just dream them up and thought, wow, this might be some kind of cool manifesto. It wasn't like that. So I took a job. This is way back in 2017 where I had reached my limit in terms of my apathy towards the whole engine. I was just over the bureaucracy, saw too much toxicity, and I needed a change. So I left a very, very big organization to take on the role of leading 14,000 really, really dedicated customer service professionals, leading the Affordable Care Act enrollment operations, as well as 1-800 Medicare.
Wow.
When I joined the organization, I was, I guess it's safe to say, warned by my immediate leader, my boss, that there was a bit of toxicity that needed to be addressed. We had a very difficult client. We needed to kind of make some changes. We had to be very overt in terms of a cultural transformation. So the night before I was going to meet with the top 40 or 50 leaders of my newly inherited organization, I was in a hotel room in Lawrence, Kansas, and I knew I needed to come with something that would at least not turn them off. I wasn't looking for wholesale, home run. I just needed to let them know. This is my first time in front of the whole group at large, by the way. I was about 90 days into the role. So the night before that meeting, I had my laptop in my lap in this kind of dark, dingy hotel room and started typing and ended up with 10 sentences, and they each began with the word "we." And that really wasn't intentional, man. There was no planning, and I'm not super creative. So those We's turned into the 10 We's. And the next morning I stepped out in front of the audience and shared with them, Darryl, the entire presentation was in black and white, which was intentional. because I didn't want there to be any ambiguity that this was our road ahead, right? These are at the time I was very direct. I said, these are our rules of the road. These principles govern how we treat each other first. And then they govern how we treat those we serve externally. And team, make no mistake, I will hold you accountable to every one of these principles. Pause, because I expect you to hold me accountable to those same principles as well.
Brilliant.
So, thank you. I didn't, and there was skepticism in the room. I would say 50% of the group was really, really excited. A quarter of the group was on the fence, kind of like, you got some proving to do, sir. And the last group was just, this guy's full of it. Let's move on. Seen this movie before. Right. So that's kind of how it arrayed afterwards. But I think the overarching message for that day, or the essence of the message, and by the way, I should note I left that organization in 2019. Those principles are still essentially the cultural manifesto of that organization, and a handful of organizations that I've either worked indirectly or partnered with. They've adopted the we's as their principles. But the overarching theme is no leadership gap. If we're going to be a team, we've got to set aside our individual isms in some cases, including perhaps our own aspirations, which sounds counterintuitive. Right. Why would I delay my journey, or why would I set aside my own goals for the benefit of this team? Well, that's what leaders do, turns out. So if your team is successful, it's impossible that the leader is not ordained with that same level of success. It just doesn't happen. So I think they had seen and heard all of the classic, what I was going to do to help from their last leader. Their last leader was kind of a dictatorial type. So I think it was refreshing in some ways, but it didn't, the real work didn't start there. Getting the adoption and gathering momentum and fellowship didn't start there. It started there rather, but it didn't end there. It's a daily process every single day. If I can, I'll share one quick story. There was thank you. There was one woman in the 25% that was kind of on the outs, like, this guy's full of it. She was in that cohort. She was a direct report of mine. And she challenged me at every turn, every email, any request I had, I was going to have to kind of pull teeth to get that answer. She was purposely difficult. And I say that so openly now because fast forward 5 years later, she's one of my closest colleagues. Nice. But here's the beauty of the story. She would challenge me. And by the way, we number 8 is we challenge each other. We number 9 is we embrace challenge. And I, at the time, for whatever intervention might have happened, or the universe was telling me, do not let her get to you. Because, Darryl, if I had banged my fist on the desk and told her, get me this, stop the bullshit, send me this, right? I'm now a hypocrite. I'm no longer living the principles that I stood in front of them and evangelized. I'm not embracing her challenge. I'm playing rank at that point. And again, I think the golden or the silver lining of that whole story is we went from an adversarial beginning to someone many, many years later. I still have regularly scheduled one-on-ones with her where we talk career stuff and challenges and stuff. So in my mind, it's really a beautiful example of how when you set aside what matters to me because I care more about you and our collective results, what that can mean on a personal level, which is so profound to me.
Yeah. And this sort of, it just resonates, Kyle. And one of the things that I find that leaders seem to be struggling with is letting go of the things that got them where they are and stepping into the things that could make them great.
That's profound.
And one of the conversations I have with leaders is I say to them, what made you a good leader or a great leader 5 years ago is not the same thing that makes you a great leader today.
Yeah.
And what's going to make you a great leader 5 years from now is going to be different. You're going to have to learn and grow and adapt. Yeah. And here's what I want you to say to the people you lead. I want you to say to them, what's going to make me a great leader 5 years from now is going to be different. And I'm going to have to learn new things. I'm going to have to try and explore and let go of the things I'm comfortable with and step into the things I'm not comfortable with.
Yeah.
I will make mistakes. I will stumble. I may fall. And when I do, my expectation is you're going to be there helping me.
And why are you comfortable sharing that expectation, Darryl?
Because it's exactly what I'm going to be doing for them.
That's it. That's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. Because it's my expectation for everyone else. And so, I mean, it's not hard for me to share vulnerabilities with folks because I've practiced, right? And, you know, I'm legally blind. I've got post-concussion syndrome. You can check out the hair. Like, mistakes were made, right? And so when we step into that, it allows other people to feel comfortable being vulnerable themselves.
Yeah.
And that's what trust is, brother.
Yeah.
It's that willingness to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
And, you know, I was talking before about uncertainty fluctuating all over the place. When it's bouncing like that, it's hard for us to step in and be just a little bit more vulnerable. And what your we's do is actually reduce uncertainty for the rest of the group. They make it easier for us to trust one another, to create an environment of psychological safety, to create a place where people can take risks, make mistakes, step into who they could become, like you did.
You know, man, you said something that really sparked a thought for me, that safe space comment. So when an organization or a team, it doesn't have to be the whole organization, when a team makes a decision to live and operate under a series of guiding principles, and let's not overthink this, right? A principle is nothing more than a fundamental truth. It's a foundation for a system of beliefs, by definition, not my words. When a team aligns around this foundation or is committed to living this system of beliefs, it makes difficult conversations, for example, makes difficult conversations so much easier to have. For example, we challenge each other when I mentioned. So I vividly remember being in staff meetings when the principals had kind of taken a life of their own, and a member of the team would give an update and someone else on the team would say, hang on, Lori, we challenge each other, right? Like, you just said something that didn't quite make sense to me. And Lori knows she has subscribed to the same series of principles that we are now obligated, because we've subscribed to, we challenge each other. We are now obligated to hear that out. Now, I went a little further once the we started to take flight, and on this one especially, we challenge each other. Challenges must be grounded in either data or experience. Opinion is a little bit of a slippery slope, and that's when people start to get alienated and feel as if it's personal. Right. Right. So the point about the safe space that you mentioned is when we're all aligned to them and can almost recite them on command. It's almost like a language or a currency that we all are on the same denomination of currency, and that value, by the way, of the currency is the same regardless of what your title is. So it does change things. But you said it, brother, you got to create that space to allow people to make mistakes, because in most environments, as you know, once the mistake is made, it's met with retribution. It's met with criticism. It's met with anything other than inspiration. And that's why would I raise my hand and try something different? Because I'm just going to get beaten over the head if I stumble.
Yeah. And I'm struggling with this with some of my, in general, right? Is this notion of letting go of mistakes that other people have made, or learning from them, being appreciative of them. You know, I have a client, and I've told this story before. His wife brings up a mistake that he made years ago every time they have a disagreement. Mm-mm. And I said to him, do you think sometimes late at night she just lays awake giving thanks to God that you made that mistake so she can bring it up every time you disagree? And he said,
it's a shame.
He started laughing, and he goes, yeah, I kind of think so. I said, so how does that prepare you to try new things with this person, to be vulnerable with them, to admit mistakes or that you don't know something? And he goes, oh God, I'd never do that. And so we don't want to see that with our teams, right? We want to both be a role model for, hey, I've made mistakes. And I think one of the powerful ones as a leader is to acknowledge, hey, when I was in your role, I got better as time went on. And these are the mistakes I made early on. Yeah. And we're all here to learn and grow and develop. Really powerful statement you made about having a shared narrative. a shared vocabulary,
Mm-hmm.
right? And some people differentiate between task conflict and relational conflict.
Ooh, say more about that.
Well, so we can be hard on problems, but soft on people, right?
Yeah, for sure.
We're focused in on the problem and not on each other.
Yeah.
And that I don't need to be right. I don't, I used to always, back when I was an academic, other academics would come to give talks. And rather than saying, oh, there's a hole there, in your logic, you've made a mistake, I would start asking questions and help reveal the problem so that we could solve it together.
Mm.
And so instead of sort of pushing for a defensive response, we're actually searching for a collaborative one, right? Where we're both on the same side of the table going, I don't think this is quite right.
Yeah.
Or I'm struggling with this. And so I take ownership of the challenge I'm facing or me not understanding. So the other person can move into the place where they're starting to answer questions. And during that process, it's a lot easier for them to go, oh, we may have missed something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
So, now, this brings me to one of the questions. So number 7, number 7.
Yep.
Is about focus on outcomes, not on activity.
Yep.
And I think I know what you're saying there, but I'd love you to explain that a little more fully for me.
Yeah. Let me first admit that of all of the 10 we's, this is the one that I've had the most instances where folks will say, I just don't agree. I don't agree with this one, Kyle. Which is, I don't know you that well, but I could tell you're quite okay disagreeing. We can agree to disagree.
Let's roll.
Huge hole, right? Huge. Amen, my man. Huge problem in this country that we can't agree to disagree, but that's for another show, I guess. Right. So you hit on we number 7. We measure ourselves by outcomes, not activity. And listen, as cold as it might sound in commerce, we pay for outcomes. Consumers do not pay for me to sit in 13 meetings a day. They don't pay for busyness. The silly example I like to use, Darryl, is I'm really, really thrilled that my Uber driver puts gasoline in the car before they pick me up, or they charge it if it's a Tesla or some EV. But I didn't pay for that, man. I paid to get from A to B. And this really raises its ugly head in especially in very large organizations, but certainly in smaller ones as well. And it's most commonly observed in meeting frequency. How often we meet, how long we meet, do we meet instead of a phone call? Do we have a meeting before the meeting because we want to make sure everyone's aware of what the original meeting is about? And I think we've started to, at least in my experience, we almost reward that activity. And I think what that ultimately results in is this almost a participation ribbon type approach where, so-and-so didn't deliver the outcome, but they were really busy. So let's not be hard on them. I look at it differently. I look at it differently. And by the way, in some of my executive coaching, I talk to very, very senior leaders and they wear their calendar like a badge of honor. Oh, you have no idea how busy I was yesterday.
Spare second. Yeah.
I could care less. Well, and to be fair, I used to tell my teams, I don't care if you work from the beach. I don't care how many hours a week. I genuinely, sincerely don't care as long as the outcomes are delivered, right? Because that's how I judge you. And that's how the real world judges us. So I think meetings become the scapegoat and we're over meetinged. Korn Ferry did a study. I quoted this in the book actually I may get the number slightly off, but I think it was 57% of respondents said they would attend a meeting even if they knew it would not advance their objectives or goals in the role that they're in. They just show up.
Right.
So I think we've got to shift from this focus on how busy am I wearing the calendar like I've earned some medal of honor or some type of award for how busy I am, and really focus on the 2, 3, 4, 5 things that are important for the role that I'm in, and allow those to be my true north, and allow leaders and members of our team to say, if this activity that I'm engaged in today does not further my objective for achieving any one of those success criteria, why am I doing it? If I'm in a meeting that doesn't lead to the end that I've been asked to achieve, or an objective that's on my to-do list, why am I in that meeting? And allow people to skip meetings, allow people to do what they have to do to get their job done. So I think, but I would love your take on it though, man, because as I said, there are people who've pushed back on this one.
So I'm going to say yes and.
Okay. In classic academic professor fashion, that is the response from almost every professor.
So I think in some situations, I absolutely agree. And this is a response in my mind to the overwhelming desire for a lot of leaders to micromanage, to monitor, all of those kinds of things. It talks indirectly, or maybe you talk directly to this notion of hybrid work environments where we're not on site, or we've got virtual teams, people are working from home. We shouldn't be as focused on how many keystrokes did you make. We should be more focused on, okay, what did you produce? What's the impact? Yeah. I completely agree with that sentiment. The challenge comes in certain environments where we don't have control over the outcomes. When we're thinking about innovation, we're thinking about
that's fair.
Setting sales markets. I had a CEO and his head of sales in the room with me, and I said, "How do you evaluate his performance?" He said, "Well, if he hits his numbers." I said, "Well, how do you know that the numbers were well set?
Yeah.
And how do you know the environment hasn't changed, right? It became incredibly easy to hit those numbers or impossible to hit those numbers."
Yeah.
And so we have to have some measure of process, not busyness, but process, because the right process will lead us to the right outcomes. So I think it's a bit of both.
Yeah.
Is, I guess, my point. Because if we're just focused on outcome, we may engage some bizarre behaviors, particularly when it comes to innovation.
Yeah, true. Well said. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So
that's true.
Now, what are the biggest challenges you face when you come into a new gig, a new client, getting the buy-in? What are some of the biggest challenges you face with that?
Is as simple and admittedly elementary as the principles are. There's no rocket science here. There's nothing new. I admit this. Where the value comes is when in the collective kind of, when these 10 principles come together to form our system of beliefs, they unite us, they align us. And when we're conspicuous about living them every single day, I mean, Darryl, I wear a bracelet 24/7 with one of the we's on it. This one's We Challenge Each Other. I've had this one for probably a year now, until I wear it out, and then I'll put another one on. And the point of that is not to brag or boast. It's to remind myself we challenge each other. So when we're all wearing them, we all remind each other that this is something that we've done. But the pushback I get, and I wouldn't necessarily call it pushback as much as I would call it resistance. And the resistance come from it's never been done. They've never had a leader walk in and say, I want you to hold me accountable to these things. They've never had a leader walk in and say, it's not about me. And frankly, it's not about you. It's about us and how we can enable each other. So I think it's foreign to a lot of folks. And then I also, something I've seen more often lately, which is I'm working on ways to kind of combat this, is some people view these principles as a mission statement or their company values. And as you know, you can't mess with the company values. Those words on a wall that no one can recite. You cannot, that's blasphemy, right? So my response to that is these are principles that enable your values. They enable your mission statement because these are action oriented, right? So it's getting people to see through a different lens, but then also, as I mentioned at the top, man, I'm not guessing. I've seen this work in massive organizations. I've seen people, and I hear from strangers since the book has been out about how the impact that these principles have had on how they raise their children in addition to their work lives.
Yeah.
You just got to.
That's when you know you're having impact, brother.
Dude, it changed these principles have changed my life, but hearing, I'll never forget this. A quick story. I gave a talk at Audi several months ago, and, I don't know, there are 50, 60 people in the room. And at the end of the talk, I opened it up for Q&A, and I just kind of hung around and we had some back and forth. And, this guy stands up, and his name's Brad. We've gotten to be buddies since then. I have a lot of respect for Brad. Leads a big organization. Can't recall if he stood up or just sat up in his chair. Now, Brad is 6 foot plus tall, former Division I football player, has muscles upon muscles, right? And he said, guys, bald guy too, really intimidating looking guy. He says, these principles if you're open to them, they will change how you view your work. They will change how you lead. And for me, it's changed how I interact and lead my family. But you got to be open to it. He said, this book changed my life. This guy changed my life. Darryl, I teared up, man. I was in front of 50 executives, and I teared up, and I sat down on the stool that was behind the podium, and I said, I got nothing. And I just let those guys keep talking. And that is, dude, that was one of the more powerful moments that I've been fortunate enough to experience down this journey.
Now, how can people get a hold of you, Kyle? I really appreciate the conversation we've had today. How can people get that impact?
Very simply, my website is kylemcdowellinc.com. I'm on essentially all social platforms at Kyle McDowell Inc. And part of the fun for me these days is getting anecdotes or stories or hearing from anyone out there that has maybe a leadership challenge they're dealing with, or I got a really unique situation this past Sunday. I received an email from a woman who was gracious enough to share the journey her team's been on for the last year, how many challenges they've overcome, what the environment was like before this year, and how her leader, Jim, has really given all for everyone's sake. And she noticed, and the team noticed, it's starting to wear on him. She said his tank looked like it's about empty. And she asked, would I just write a note to him that they could frame and put in his office as a year-end shot in the arm type thing? I cannot tell you what that means to me. I can't tell you how good that makes me feel. And I don't want your audience to hear that and say, well, that's some guy who's getting praised for his book. Anyone who takes interest in making someone else's existence or their journey better, you'll get that same feeling, which is to me the feeling of feelings. So anyway, those are the social handles, and that's how you can get at me.
Thank you for the work you're doing, Kyle, and for the impact you're having. And thanks for showing up today on the Imperfect Cafe.
Likewise, Darryl. Thank you for having me.
Wow, that sounded great. How did you enjoy your time with Kyle?
We really connected. And this is going to sound fairly similar for most of our guests. I really liked him. I tend to have a positive story about most people, and I find that they usually don't disappoint me. Yeah. I really enjoy talking with Kyle. It's not often you get to talk to someone who's led 15,000 people.
Yeah.
What
did you think about the 10 W's? Like, we went into this, I listened to it, and you explored some overlaps. How do you think it fits in when you think about the trust model?
Well, I think we got asked at one point by some of our clients to simplify. How do we even start? What are the actions that we take? And that pushed us to really think about actions that we could take, a canvas that we could develop. It feels like some of these we's are aligned with that, getting people to take action that actually leads to changes.
We've been talking a lot about hygiene, trust hygiene. Seems like those we's lend itself well to some of the trust hygiene elements that we've identified, but there's also overlap with the levers.
Yeah, there absolutely is. And so, we make mistakes rather than sort of waiting. Some of those we's are powerful in nature, and it actually gives people something to do. right? It's not as theoretical. It's more applied in my mind.
Yeah, I love the two-way street around challenge. We challenge each other and we do it diplomatically, and we embrace challenge when we're on the receiving end. It's a great way to understand that sets up conflict, or it kind of diverts away from what could be conflict into healthier discussions.
Yeah, and some people divide conflict into task-related versus relational, right?
Yeah.
And to me, what that speaks to is focusing on task rather than individual, and finding a way to do that doesn't provoke defensiveness.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought you guys hit some really important topics that we've been talking about. I wanted to bring a couple of them up because I think there was some. You both had some aha moments, and there were some wow moments, and you guys talked about toxic leadership and examples of toxic leadership. What did you think about that?
So I think this is a topic that's coming up more and more often, and you and I have discussed this a little bit too. That sometimes folks come across as toxic, and we're not always sure why.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a deep-seated part of who they are? Because I refuse to believe that people wake up in the morning, other than a select few, and say, I'm going to be a jerk today.
Yeah.
Most people have a reason for what they're doing. They feel like it's the right decision. Are they feeling constrained by their role? Are they feeling insecure? Do they just not feel well prepared? So there's all these reasons that we can have for being toxic. Once we start to unravel those, I think we have a better chance of getting a leader that's maybe more serviceable.
I think, there's two things that keep coming up, and with our clients, this fluctuation of uncertainty creates stress and anxiety, and in unexpected corners, when new people are hired or when changes are made, or you're looking at roles and responsibilities or org charts, it can be really unnerving because we're just not at a solid place. And the second one that I think really doesn't help is slack in the system. Like, people don't seem to have the 5 to 10 to 15 minutes to prepare, to think, to be able to put on their best, step into things in the best way possible. And as a result, they're more stressed. They have a shorter leash. They're more emotionally reactive potentially, or more checked out. Like, it can be on both sides, right? And it's not helpful for getting work done. I think we create more problems than we save by packing our schedule in.
I'm reminded of Adam Grant's conversation around being a precrastinator.
Yeah.
Right? Where he says that he does things immediately and doesn't give himself time to think or be creative.
Yeah.
And that's the downside. And I think you're hitting on something very similar here with people being overscheduled.
Yeah.
Having no slack in the system for them to be creative, to be problem solvers, to think deeply about things, or to check with their colleagues about what does good look like, or how things are landing.
Yeah, when you don't have time, nuanced conversations go out the window. You have to be so regimented and precise and tactical to get through the agenda or the items or the issues or the list. It becomes very difficult.
Well, you become so focused on the immediate future rather than thinking about the long-term nature of relationships. I've talked with clients about, hey, if we take a moment to create a positive relationship now, when problems pop up in the future, it's more likely we're going to get grace.
Yeah.
It's more likely that we're going to be able to collaboratively solve those problems rather than provoking defensiveness and a reactive response.
I think another topic you kind of jumped into is really around these different challenges that leadership is facing, and how there is this almost like a new definition or a new evolving label or style that we need to adapt.
Yeah. And, you and I were talking about this, and it was a bit of an aha moment for me a couple of weeks ago. identifying what good leadership looks like universally seems like a flawed approach.
Mm-hmm.
Because, there are political leaders who are very polarizing. And some people think that they're a fantastic leader and some people think they're a terrible leader based on some of the same attributes.
Yeah.
But what we can do is actually come up with a good definition for what a great leader looks like within our group.
Yeah.
And maybe that's definitely a conversation that should be had more often. What does excellence look like? Not universally, but for this group.
For this setting, for this context, for this challenge. Yeah.
Yeah. So, one leader isn't perfect in all settings.
Mm-hmm.
And one leadership style isn't going to be effective or optimal in every environment.
Mm-hmm.
So there are times when we need to be nurturing and supportive. There are times when we need to be firm. And when we're protecting our own, there's times when we need to be tough.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really, it seems like a moving target right now. So, taking the time, again, it's intentional and nuanced to define what good and what excellence look like for a role and for a leadership role, and then validating that with your people. That's it's not like a organizational citizenship behavior that we do normally, right? And you used to be able to say, well, we did that 2 years ago, or that was clear, last month. And you got to ask yourself what's changed since then, and how are things spraying? And there might be some real good reasons.
Right. I think one of the things I liked about the work that Kyle's doing is he actually gives people something to hold on to.
Yeah.
Like driftwood in the rapids. And it's a place that leaders can go to actually start having good hygiene. They may not want to adopt all 10 W's right off the bat, but picking a couple of those to say, this is where I'm going to focus. This is where my group is going to focus to start with. Because 10 can feel overwhelming.
Yeah.
But just having a place where they can have a conversation. Because I think I talk to a lot of leaders who say it's harder to be a leader now than it's ever been.
Yeah, I love, being a Navy guy or an ex-Navy guy, you use the term, the 10 W's are like rules of the road. They're principles that allow you to navigate the winding path, the changes, and how to show up. And it gives you so things can be chaotic or uncertain, but it gives you this foundation that you go, I know I can rely on these things because we've agreed this is how we interact together. And so I think it kind of creates that kind of safe haven, that raft that we can step on and deal with the chaos around us and go, okay, now we can move to the next place. So I really like that.
Yeah, it's going to be something, his book is something I'm going to be recommending, not just to our audience, but to people that I'm working with.
Yeah.
As a possible set of insights.
Yeah. Another one that jumped out at me is the shift in social contract. And we've been talking about that, but it seemed really to hit him and resonate with him.
Yeah. And we've been seeing this pop up in places, in the news, in different stories. The fact that people don't feel as engaged, they don't feel like the social contract is being held up by organizations. We just spoke to the situation with Wayfair where they're making $900 million in profit. They come to all their people and say, hey, you need to work harder, and then fire 13% of them. I mean, why did they need to work harder? Because you would assume it was because there's more demand, that there was more to be done. And now all of a sudden you're laying off a significant chunk of your workforce. What's the narrative that we're supposed to take away from that?
Yeah, I think, it's kind of one of those things that harder, not smarter, right? And it's probably has something to do with, earnings, right? And financial, and the CEO pulls a line out and says, work harder, because that will equal more earnings. And it's like, come on, we got to be smarter than that. We got to be more nuanced than that. We can't just, call out such a large group of our employees and ask them to do something without a nuanced approach.
Well, and how tone deaf is it to have that? Because the message I take from that, the story I develop from that is, somebody doesn't think 900 million is enough.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that money can be shared around a little more.
Yeah. Like what are acceptable profit margins? What are acceptable salaries? And it's like stakeholder earnings, we've got to figure out some new kind of co-op style to get this influence off the table, because we're driving our businesses to ruin through the financial pressures that we're putting on them.
Yeah. And the problem with having a shareholder mindset or putting their rights above everyone else's is that they're not in it for the long term.
No.
You may have some investors who are, but boy, they don't care about the long-term sustainability of an organization. They want money now, and they'll jump ship the moment they don't think they're getting what they want.
Yeah, there's, we got to be careful. I'm sure there's, 5 or maybe 10% of the investors out there that actually want to see the change that a company is bringing to the table for the world. But I think for the most part, you're right. It's just about how many cents on the dollar am I going to get?
It's a misaligned set of incentives that's led to the complete destruction of the social contract.
Yeah.
And so now when companies like Wayfair say work harder, if I'm an employee, my first question is, for who?
Yeah. And the newer generations are really going, the emperor has no clothes. This does not make sense to me. You're saying I need to do this for what? And I can't even own a house. I can't get a place to rent. I can't eat and go out. I can't enjoy my life. It's not good enough. We have to reevaluate how we've created these patterns, because it isn't fair. It's not equity by any of the definitions that are out there.
No.
So,
no.
Big question.
Yeah.
What did you learn?
So I learned I learned I like Kyle McDowell and would love to work with him moving forward.
Yeah.
And I liked some of the wheeze that he had. I'm going to attribute those to him when we discuss, as we always do, right? Mm-hmm. We try to take care to, when we talk about the model, we talk about where we got the ideas that we use, who has a deeper understanding of those. I think that it would be great to try to adopt and incorporate some of the wheeze that Kyle talks about into the work we're doing.
Yeah. Awesome. The first two resonate, me being a guy that is very much built on integrity. We do the right thing always, and we lead by example. Actually, the first three, we say what we're doing and then we do it. That's just kind of my MO, right? And so it's interesting to see that as his first very three, because I think that's something we could all do a better job with. And it's hard. There's no slack in the system. We're making commitments like they're wishes, as opposed to commitments like they're actual concrete things that I need to fall through on.
And this is part of the challenge when the world starts moving so fast.
Yeah.
Is it gets harder and harder to make commitments that we can follow through on, because we don't have control over outcomes. We've just had something go off the rails with a client, and we've had to move other appointments around.
Yeah.
That can be seen as a lack of integrity.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so when we explain to those who we've inconvenienced, we're going to have to say, this is why we did it. And it's part of our values. When our clients really need us, they really need us.
Okay. Maybe one last comment. During during your interview, your podcast with Kyle, your conversation, it became he had a big moment, and he talks about his story about building trust with that difficult person, the adversarial woman. That was a difficult relationship for him as he started into this large endeavor with 10 to 14,000 people,
Right.
and he converted her. How do you think, like, if you put your trust coach hat on, what did he do?
So I think there were certain elements of vulnerability that he engaged. He exposed himself a bit. And then he started to develop some empathy.
Yeah.
Trying to understand where she was coming from. And that's often what we do with clients when they're struggling.
Yeah.
Is get them to be a little bit open, which is hard, right? If you and I were in conflict, it would be hard for me to open up a bit to you because I'm worried about how you're going to respond. But having that moment where we try to provoke empathy, where we try to say, what do you think that person's story is?
Mm-hmm.
That seems to be a real aha moment for folks. And I think he started to just naturally engage in some of those things. And it's where some of his wheeze came from, right?
Yeah, that's it. It's kind of a little bit part of the origin story. So, and he seemed to, you hit it up well. You summarized it well. It was a combination of some vulnerability, then a little bit of empathy combined with a healthy amount of curiosity, and kind of use that as a feedback loop to kind of move the needle, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Any closing thoughts?
I hope people buy the book. I hope they buy his book, and start thinking about how they would apply the wheeze, because they can work as a leader, but they can also work as a family or as a parent. Some version of those. And like I said, you may not choose to adopt all 10 of them, or you may decide to change them slightly for your own circumstance, but I think it's a good place to start.
Yeah. Excellent.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you, Darryl. And we'll see everybody on the next podcast.